Perfecto. Bueno, vamos a empezar. Muy buenos días, muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta sesión del Seminario de Estudios Multidisciplinarios sobre Industrias Creativas y Culturales. En esta ocasión albergamos la presentación del libro ROUTLEDGE Handbook of Sport, Fans and Fandom, un estupendo trabajo multidisciplinario coeditado por las doctoras Danielle Sarver-Coombs y Ann Osborne, a quienes queremos agradecer también por su disposición para presentar este trabajo con nosotros. También queremos agradecer a la doctora Dorothy Collins Capella, autora de uno de los capítulos, y por supuesto al doctor Jorge Galindo por comentarlo. Esta sesión será en inglés a partir de ahora y al finalizar todas las presentaciones tendremos un espacio para preguntas y respuestas, comentarios, ya sea por aquí o a través del canal del CISAN en YouTube. Si es más cómodo para ustedes hacer las preguntas en español, no hay ningún problema. So let's start this session with a broad presentation about the book with its editors, Dr. Danielle Sarver-Coombs. She is a professor in the School of Media and Journalism at Kent State University. And Dr. Ann Osborne, she's a professor in the Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us. This is exciting that we get to talk a bit about the work. And it's exciting that we have one of our authors, Dr. Dorothy Collins, with us as well to talk about her chapter. So we thought we would just talk a little bit about how the project kind of came about and evolved, and a little bit about our work that led us to studying sports fandom. Danielle and I both are communications scholars, and we are communication scholars that are rooted primarily in advertising. And so we first got interested in looking at sports and sports fandom from that perspective, of the sort of marketing perspective. And it began with us doing some research that was looking at how the English Premier League was evolving as foreign ownership was moving into the Premier League, and the way that that was being cross-promoted with the NFL. So at the time, this was a number of years ago, the owner of the NFL Cleveland Browns purchased Aston Villa Football Club in Birmingham, England. And so we were looking at the way that they were being cross-promoted. And one of the things that we quickly noticed as we were traveling to the UK and doing research is that we were often two of very few women who were at the EPL matches. And so having done research rooted in feminist scholarship and theory, we were really interested in that phenomenon. And this was about the same time that the NFL was really putting a big push on marketing towards women. And so that sparked our interest. And we ended up co-authoring a book on female NFL fans. And that sort of started us down this path of looking at fandom and how scholars think about and define fandom. And this has been a sort of growing field. So Routledge reached out to us and said that they thought it was time that there be a handbook that really looked at sports fans and fandom. And so that's sort of how we got here. Danielle, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So we, when the editor from Routledge reached out to us, we immediately started making a list of the people that we really wanted to be part of this. And we very consciously wanted to diversify or really foreground voices that didn't necessarily always get amplified the ways we hoped that they would. And so we were very conscious of trying to have authors from different countries, but also not just where a lot of sport fandom research has been centered, which is the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So trying to find authors who are from different parts of the world to talk about what was happening in their areas, have women, people of color, really representing as much of a diversity of voices as we could in this field. So we, reached out to colleagues and authors whose work that we really liked and respected. So that's actually how Dorothy got involved. I cited one of her pieces on a book chapter I did on remote fandom. And I was like, this is great. And I really want to hear more. And so I reached out and asked her to be part of this book. So really, we looked at this handbook as an opportunity to both give a really sort of thoughtful overview of what's happening in the fields of sports fandom, but also as a way to start bringing together all the different disciplines where this work happens. As Anne mentioned, we are in communications and media, and that's where a lot of sports fan research has happened, but not all. So we really made an effort to bring in economists, bring in sports sociologists, all kinds of different areas so that we could get as comprehensive a look at this topic as possible. So Dan, should we talk a little bit about the gaps that we found through this?
Yeah, and again, I will just say that our commitment to having a broad overview of this discipline was born out of our own experience. That when we began doing our research on fandom, one of the things that the traditional way that fandom had been operationalized and that a lot of the research had been conducted was very quantitative. Danielle and I both lean more towards qualitative research and qualitative work. But the quantitative efforts to measure fandom and to be able to categorize and create taxonomies of fandom oftentimes would indicate that women weren't very committed fans. And that simply wasn't our experience. We were both devoted sports fans. We actually are devoted NFL fans to rival teams. And so, we knew that that wasn't true. And so when we started to look at how the research had been conducted, it was clear that the way that they were operationalizing fandom was from a very male perspective on what kinds of behaviors are associated with fandom. And so we wanted to take a more qualitative approach and look at female fandom within a hypermasculine sport, the NFL. And so that really informed, as we moved into editing this book, thinking about, well, where are the fans? Who are the fans that often get left out of these conversations? And as Danielle mentioned, the vast majority of this research has been done in the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. So, I mean, if you just think globally, the importance of sport across the world, and yet what we know from a research discipline perspective is very limited. It is very white, it is very male, it is very global north. And so we tried as best we could to identify scholars who were doing work outside of that realm. But we also note that we were not entirely successful in those efforts, that we really do need more research that looks at the global South, that looks at the experiences of marginalized communities and their fandom, and that we need research that looks at, you know, in the United States, the vast majority of the research has been done on the big four sports, in the big four in the US, so football, basketball, hockey, and baseball. Across Europe, most of the research has been done on soccer. New Zealand and Australia work on rugby. So we have these big gaps. You know, cricket is a enormously popular sport, and yet we don't have as much research on the fans for cricket. And you know, pick any region of the world and you could probably identify a sport that is left out of our scholarship. So part of what we wanted to do with the book is highlight voices, as Danielle said, but also to issue a call to scholars outside of the traditional avenues that the scholarship has been done, and ask them to please do more research and let us enjoy and learn from what they are finding in those streams of research. So yeah, so again, we did our best, but I will also acknowledge that our book does also still skew very much towards white scholars and scholarship about white fandom. We do not have as much BIPOC representation as we would have hoped. I think we did a very good job of representing gender diversity within the book, but there's lots of work still to be done.
And that's something else I just wanted to really quickly touch on. And I did forget the UK. A lot of the research is done in the UK and a lot of centers are there. And Europe has been very active in funding research in sport media, sport communication, sport fandom, like sport sociology. So part of the reason that that research has been so successful is funding. They have money to do it, right? You also have a smaller geographic area. So in terms of doing qualitative research, you can get to all the matches by train or drive, and it's fairly easy if you're looking at English Premier League football, soccer. Whereas in the States, you know, Annie and I, our football teams are the local rivals, but it's 2 hours apart and you have to drive and there's no other way to get between those places. So it's a very different, there are structural issues that affect some of the ways, like why some places are more successful than others. But certainly our hope is that we can also start connecting scholars through this. So for example, reading a chapter about remote fandom that Dot wrote and saying, oh, I really want to look at this in another location. So let me reach out and you know, figure out how to bridge these things. I'm working on building out some of this scholarship with a team in Brazil. So again, trying to really help improve the representation in our field through both intentionally developing scholarship and foregrounding scholarship, making sure we're citing people from other areas, making sure we're bringing their research to the forefront, but also really thinking about how can we help find solutions and use our scholarship as a lens for that. And with that, again, because you're a sociology school, I believe. And so, you know, really trying to bridge what's happening in sports sociology and sport communication and sports marketing, which is separate than sports communication, and all these different areas, because we have similar tracks of scholarship happening, but we don't always know what's happening in those other fields, because sports tends to be a subset of lots of fields rather than the primary place we're publishing. So really trying to think about how do we draw these scholars and the scholarship together so that we can have a broader view and increase the impact of what we're doing.
I'll also say that one of the things that was super exciting for us in the fact that Routledge decided that this was something that it wanted to do was, and the fact that they came to us, like they had determined it was time for this handbook, was just the acknowledgement that sport is a legitimate area of research. I think that probably most people who do work in this area have at one point or another had somebody indicate to them that their research is frivolous, unimportant, and so I think that this handbook is sort of a moment for sport research to sort of be acknowledged for the importance that it is, and sport is incredibly important as an economic force. It is incredibly important as a social phenomenon. It is, for the work that we've done on gender, I say all the time that I like doing research on sports because I like sports myself, I'm a fan, but that's not the primary driver. The primary driver for me is that sports is just a really fascinating lens through which to look at gender issues, because it is one of the last bastions of a clearly divided binary within society. And we're seeing that right now with all of the conversations around trans and intersex athletes and who gets to compete and who counts as a real woman in terms of sports. So all of these conversations, I think, really for a long time weren't seen as important. And so I am proud of the book because I think that it is also a great indicator that those of us who do research on sports are still doing research, and it's still important research, and it has implications beyond just frivolous entertainment.
So I think that wraps up most of what we wanted to cover during our piece. I know we started a little bit late, so we kept it pretty tight, but
it's okay. If you want to take more space, yeah, we can.
I think we covered all of our bullet points. So I don't know if we want to do Dorothy's presentation, or do we want to just move to questions about what Annie and I have done, or?
No, I think we can move on to Dorothy's presentation and then Jorge's commentary, and then we can have time to question. Great. Thank you very much. That was a very complete cover up of the whole introduction of the book and the concerns of your chapter as well. Okay, give me a second, please. Okay. Now we will have a second presentation by Dr. Dorothy Collins-Capel. She is an associate professor of sports management at Lake Erie College in Painesville, Ohio. Her primary area of study is how individuals use sports to generate social benefits and form a sense of community with others.
So good morning to everybody. I found the introduction to the book really interesting as well, because I was asked to come on as an author, and I was super excited to get her to write a chapter specifically about non-local fans. But I hadn't heard much of the backstory. I kind of was like, how did they find me? I mean, I know I'm like in Ohio, but how did they find me? So I was really excited to get to write about this topic. I'm really, really passionate about the idea of non-local fans and about fandom in general. My foray into this field actually came from reading an article very early in my graduate school career about whatever happened to the Hartford Whalers fans. Because if you go to Hartford, there's still Hartford Whalers fans. What there isn't is Hartford Whalers. And so there was a study done by Craig Hyatt up at Brock University in Canada, where he actually went and talked to people and found out, like, what do you do? You know, like, why are you still, when I ask you why you're still a fan, why are you a fan of a team that hasn't existed for more than a decade? Like, do you watch other kinds of hockey now? Are you a Carolina Hurricanes fan? Because that's who became the Hartford Whalers became. So that's sort of what launched my interest in this whole area. So what I've done here is I've kind of made some slides just because I think maybe they help people to follow along. So let me share my screen here. Can you guys see that?
Not yet.
Oh dear. It says it's shared. Let me try again. Let me try again.
Sure.
It worked before, right?
Yes. There it is. Dot, you are on mute. Okay, I think it's not. No.
I think I have to. All right, there we go. Am I now, can you see it? And can you now hear me as well?
Both.
Yes.
Oh, good. So like I said, I just made some slides to kind of give people something to look at, to make sure that people feel sort of connected. Just kind of as an introduction, it's long been known, been in the sport management field, which is, you know, admittedly fairly new, right? The first people to start studying fandom strictly from the sport perspective kind of came out of the psychology fields. And we started looking at these ideas that there is some sort of social benefit to be gained from participating as a fan, right? And this idea of, we had some early works that really focused just on like socialization in the stands, and what kind of sense did people get from being affiliated with a team, an organization. And of course, that research has now been evolving for about 30 years. By the time I sort of entered the field as an academic researcher, we had pretty much come to the conclusion, right, that fans gain social benefits from the development of a strong sense of social identity. But what is less clear is how much that sense of connection or that sense of community is just illusion, like a quick moment, like a moment in time. Everybody's in the stadium cheering together, but are you getting anything from that connection after you leave the stadium? But regardless, we do know that people who consider themselves highly identified, they consume more, both from a social perspective of they're more likely to watch, they're more likely to go, and from a more revenue driven standpoint of they're more likely to buy. So traditionally, for many, many years, this all went on largely through in-person attendance at local sporting events. But sport is a really global enterprise. And as the world has gotten smaller and technology has gotten better, we have an increasing number of people who are not local to their favorite teams. I mean, I sort of talk about in America how, Americans are not the best, like most well-traveled crowd. The number of English Premier League fans that will never even have a passport, much less go see a game outside of the United States. And so to me, this is sort of an interesting topic. Now, I just want to set this up and talk a little bit about what we're really talking about when we talk about team identification. And if you read the sport management literature, I guess I would say people have not been particularly precise with their language on this topic. We use the word team identification very often, but when I read the literature and when my advisor, Bob here, who some of you may be familiar with, read the literature, there seemed to be talking really about two different constructs. And I've kind of drawn you a little model here. Team identification, and Dr. Here and a scholar, Dan Locke from the UK, got together to try to look through the literature and basically create a theoretical line in the sand that says, hey, some of this literature, team identification, describes the relationship not just between the individual and the team, but between the individuals that all support the same team. There is a component, it's like a triangle, right, of the relationship between the individuals and the team, but there's also a fundamental component of the relationship between the individuals that share this love of the same team. And that approach to team identification is based pretty strongly on social identity theory, which has been around since the 70s. It basically says people form their sense of identity based on the groups that they're members of. And so that would be the idea that I am a fan of the Cleveland Browns, and that is a group that I am a member of. And so I have a relationship with other people that are a member of that same group. As we look through the literature, we will also find times where this relationship is mentioned or discussed, but what they're really talking about is just the relationship between the individual and the team. And those theorists, those scholars, really base their work on identity theory, which talks about where a person fits in the social structure of any social construct. Sort of to be clear, I tend to work within the social identity theory. However, my dissertation was the first empirical test of Lock and Here's work. And so what we've alluded to or began to approach was the idea that, in fact, these two constructs are separate, but at least in the case of sports fans, they are inextricably linked. Like they build upon each other. There's almost no research that suggests like how they are connected or how they build on each other. But for the purposes of this, for the most part, social benefits really come not so much just from the relationship between the individual and the team, but when we get to that next level where you have some sort of relationship with other individuals who support the same team, where the team becomes the focal point. So, you know, there was a time where people in communities, everyone was fans of the same team. People tended to be fans of the same teams and places that were very tightly connected to where they live. Why has that changed? I think there's sort of been over the last, 30 or 40 years, there have been like sort of this perfect storm of conditions that have led to the non-local fan, though, like that demographic and that dynamic of rooting just for a team in your community. One is that population has become increasingly mobile, right? Large number of people relocate from the hometown that they were raised in. I think every year, 10% of Americans move to a different state, right? So population communities are much more fluid now. I think there's also certainly, at least in America, been a decline in many of the traditional like social supports, like civic organizations, like the Lions Club, like tight ties to religious groups. But individuals still want a sense of community, right? That sense of community, that sense of belonging that came from membership in those kind of groups. People are less interested in those groups, but they're still super interested in having a sense of community. There's a lot of talk today about how people are increasingly connected through technology, but they are like increasingly alone. And so I think people are still seeking out ways to find that community. And then the third, like sort of perfect storm of this is that technology has come along to the point where you can truly remain engaged with your team. When I first left my hometown as New York, I grew up as a New York sports fan. When I was 16, I left to go to college almost 1,000 miles away. And it was almost impossible for me to remain engaged with those teams. If you asked me what teams I was still a fan of, I would tell you, being a Mets fan is hugely important to me. Being a Jets fan is hugely important to me. But actually engaging with the teams was really difficult in the middle of Wisconsin. So the rise of technology has allowed people that reside outside those markets, though, now you can effectively consume your sport product. I could watch every single Mets game now if I wanted to. I can watch the Jets. I can watch the Rangers. Because there's the rise of the sports bar with satellite TV and TV that plays every single game you could ever want to watch, right? Allows me to go to a bar and encounter other people that are cheering for the same team. So even if going to the stadium is not realistic because I'm very far away, I can go down the street to Buffalo Wild Wings and probably find at least 5 or 6 other people who are as excited about that game as I am. So those 3 pieces to me like come together because the first 2 could have happened if we didn't have a way for people to engage with their teams. I think it would never have come about. I think also that another piece of this technology is, of course, the internet. It allows fans to connect virtually, and there's been some great research done on virtual fan groups and how people use the internet to create meaningful relationships with other fans of the same team that are not in their geographic area. So this extends pretty far. Just like as I looked at this, Sort of over the years of doing this research, I've been kind of involved with this topic for about 10 years now. We've come up with this umbrella term of a non-local fan, which is a generic term, but there isn't just one kind of non-local fan, right? We have the displaced fan, which was kind of where I started. And the displaced fan is someone who roots for a team that is connected to a hometown or a geographic area that they no longer live in. And as I studied them, I very quickly learned that not only is there a displaced fan, but there is a second and a third and a fourth generation displaced fan, right? And if your grandparents are from Boston, there's a good chance that you're a Red Sox fan. There are also non-local fans that don't have any geographic ties at all to these teams. And this was sort of interesting to me when we moved away from like the biggest teams with like national attention, right? Like everybody knows there's Dallas Cowboy fans everywhere. But it wasn't until I started my research on non-local fans that looked at New York Jets fans that I realized non-local fans are everywhere, right? It's like everybody knows there's a Steelers bar in Fairbanks, Alaska, but what people don't realize is there are like committed fans for every team. And the reasons that these people are tied to these teams, sometimes it's just to be different from other people around you. Sometimes it is because they're fans of a sport they participate in and that isn't widely played in their area. And I think this is really interesting on a global level, right? I think this explains a lot of soccer fans, kids who grew up playing soccer. There is Major League Soccer here, but it's not at the same level as European soccer. People still feel very tied to the game that they participated in. There are fans that like teams because of something about their aesthetic or their persona or what they represent, and they identify with that. And then there are simply people who like to root for a winner. And while we often like kind of laugh at those people as bandwagon fans, the reality is some of them do in fact hold on to become really highly identified fans. And when the team loses its dominance, as is the case for pretty much all sport teams at some point, right? Those people still hang on. So this idea of a non-local fan, it's not it's a generic term. There are like lots of subsets of non-local fans, and they are all a little bit different. I find actually, to be honest, I've sort of continued to do this research. And what I actually find the most interesting, I think, is sort of the second and beyond generation displaced fans. Like I think the fact that team identification is so durable that it can withstand like sort of the peer pressure of what third grade tells you you're supposed to be a fan of because your family is from somewhere else. And I've done quite a bit of research on minor league baseball fans, and it is really amazing when the Pawtucket Red Sox come to play a team in Pennsylvania somewhere or Ohio somewhere, the number of Red Sox fans that you're going to find, and people who have kids. And when you talk to these people, they're like, well, this is how we make sure our kids stay Red Sox fans because we can't be running to Boston, every month. So there's some really, to me, that second generation displaced fan is very telling. It tells how strong these connections can be. So my research has really all been about, but where does this go? Like, what does this really do for these people? And so my Jets study, which I spent 2 years watching New York Jets football in bars in South Carolina with a group of people that had been watching Jets games together for more than 20 years. And in this group were people of every dynamic, of every demographic background, of every belief system, and of every reason to be a Jets fan. I mean, we had other displaced New Yorkers. We had people who had grown up in South Carolina, but had a family member or some other like sort of social connection that had socialized them into being a Jets fan. We had people who had a family member that had played for the Jets many years before. I mean, every possible reason that you could think of for someone to be a fan. People who were from New York, but had never been there. And this group had enough continuity and enough continued history that there were some adult children of group members that had started coming as children. And now when they like came home from college or they came home to visit mom and dad, would still have a strong enough tie to come see the group and knew all the older members. Like, I mean, I have lived out of South Carolina now for 5 years. Much of the group, much of the makeup of the group has actually changed now through people moving, and two of the oldest members of the group have passed away. And I still remain connected to these people through social media. I still have at least some conversations with them. And let me tell you, many of these people are in very different places in terms of like their personal ideology than I am. But this tie to a football team that essentially never wins and causes its fans more frustration than joy is sort of amazing. So I would say that in the time that I was there and doing this research and engaging actively with this group, there was absolutely social capital being built, right? I went to lots of non-football events, and that's kind of what I looked at, like, does this branch out beyond people's life into other parts? And absolutely, we went to birthday parties, we went to Christmas parties that had nothing to do with football and that involved people's families also. People got recommendations for services in the community. So what it came for me as someone who was completely out of place in South Carolina, right? As a New Yorker, like far away from everything I knew, it became a way for me to socialize myself into a new community by making connections to people who were either from there or had been there for considerably longer. So my answer was I actually did generate quite a bit of social capital. This group was capable of holding on to quite a bit of social capital. So like, why does any of this matter, right? The question about, is this all frivolous because it's sport? Well, it matters because it's a way that people are connecting with each other from a societal perspective. It matters because it's allowing people to create a sense of community and to be more strongly connected to their communities in other ways, right? These connections that start out like little tiny spider webs with their team at the center start to spread out as they become more like initiated into new communities or into these communities. From the business perspective, because I do work through a management lens, for organizations, for sport organizations, this is an economic driver. It matters because there's the potential to generate revenue from these fans. And so my answer when people say, you know, are these groups good enough to create social capital, right? There's been writing saying, you know, sort of Putnam's bowling alone, right? Where social capital is dying, and we're you know, on the horizon are these sort of gloom and doom predictions of look at what's happening to these organizations. I think social capital is not dying. It's simply evolving to meet a more modern population. And I think that the individuals who are using sport in this way are figuring out how to make the organizations that they are participating in, the fan groups that they are part of, how they can structure those groups in such a way that they do generate social capital for their members. I don't think this is an exact science. I don't think that every sport fan group is capable of generating social capital, but I think when they evolve organically, the ones that do generate social capital for their members, I think that those groups have a lot in common with more traditional social supports that create that kind of social capital. So that's kind of where I'm at. That was sort of my little general overview. I know I went about 20 minutes. So I am happy to like answer any questions or move on from here.
Thanks very much. It was very interesting, and I think particularly this line of study is very stimulating for us at CISAN because it can sparkle a lot of ideas on how to research, maybe migrant communities or fandom here in Mexico City tied to the NFL, etc. Jorge, give me a second again. Okay. Dr. Jorge Galindo will make a commentary on the book. He's a professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the Autonomous Metropolitan University, Campus Coajimalpa. Jorge, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, first of all, I want to thank Alejandro and Yolanda for inviting me to comment this very interesting book. And I would like to thank as well Daniela and not only for being here, but actually for having edited such a wonderful work. And as well, Dorothy, for this very interesting presentation. And to all of you who are joining us in this presentation, well, thank you for being here. I usually like to talk freely in my presentations, but since my spoken English must be a little bit rusty after all this time speaking Spanish in Zoom for so long, I've decided to read a great deal of my presentation, but eventually I'm going to improvise a little bit. So here I go. First of all, I want to say that maybe not all the time, but very often, there seems to be a certain disconnection between academia and society. Yes, that society, the one that we are supposed to study. Amongst other reasons, this happens because, as Daniel and Anne acknowledged in the introduction to this handbook, there are social phenomena considered by academia or by academics as less serious, as you were saying earlier today, than others, and usually sport and fandom are amongst these less serious or supposedly less serious subjects. Outside of academia, however, who would dare to say that sport is not a serious matter, since it means so much to so many people all over the world? Myself, I'm a sports fan as well. I'm going to say something about that later, but well, whereas only a bunch of people care about social sciences, millions of people watch sports every day. There's no doubt that the importance of sports goes well beyond its economic and cultural impact. As Daniel L1 shows in his article, sports fandom fulfills personal and societal needs as well. A book like this shows us that we should study not only what is important to us, social scientists, or what we think that is important, or important for society, but that we must eventually also study what is important to people. Maybe then social sciences would be less irrelevant in the public sphere, and more people would find them appealing. Being myself a fan of many sports, many US sports as well, because that's very important to say. Here in Mexico, we all have this dual sports identity, and sometimes even not only dual, but multiple, because we have our local teams, we have our US teams, and we have our European teams as well when it comes to soccer. But we all have here like a baseball team, a football team, basketball team, sometimes even a hockey team, although that is not all that common. But well, for this reason alone, for this very interesting topic, even before I say anything about the quality of the content of the book, this handbook is worth celebrating. But well, after this very long opening statement, I want to say a couple of things about the book itself. The goal of the book, as stated by its editors, is to provide a representation of sports fans and fandom studies as comprehensive and widespread as possible. To reach this goal, 51 authors from all over the world and from many different disciplines were invited to write a contribution. Due to a lack of communication between the scholars who study sports, there is almost no interdisciplinary work on the field. In this regard, one of the main aims of the handbook is to begin building connections and fostering conversations across subject areas. For this reason, we find in the handbook contributions from many different disciplines, such as sociology, gender studies, kinesiology and health studies, economics, sport and urban policy, cultural studies, psychology, marketing, business communication, media, gaming, and sports management. That's a very impressive interdisciplinary effort in this book, and I think that is very appealing for all of us here, because we are as well. Although, for example, I am a sociologist, I work in a very interdisciplinary social sciences department. In this regard, the handbook works as a meeting point for researchers. While all of this must be celebrated, there is a limitation that the editors themselves acknowledge. And you have said something about this earlier today as well. Most of the chapters come from scholars in North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. That is mainly from English-speaking countries, mainly. And while I know that this is not the place to discuss the power differentials in the world system of science, I do want to pass the opportunity to invite our colleagues from English-speaking countries who might be watching this presentation or who might watch this presentation later, to learn other languages in order to read the social science books and papers produced outside of the above-mentioned countries and regions, and to actively promote the translation of social sciences works from other linguistic realms, since you are really missing out on very interesting pieces of research. I'm going to say something about that later today. I want to make clear that I say this with the utmost respect for the work of my English-speaking colleagues. You know, obviously, we all read English and we all learn a lot about English, but we want to share more with you and the rest of the world. And sometimes it is not easy to write everything that one produces in English. But let's go back to the book. This handbook includes 34 chapters divided in 3 parts. The first part is called "What is a fan and how do we know?" The second part is "Who fans are," and the third one is "What fans do." As you can imagine, the book is rather long, and I won't be able to talk about all of the chapters. For this reason, I will only focus on some chapters. Being a sociologist myself, as I said earlier, I found particularly appealing the chapters about social needs, gender, and identity. Earlier, I mentioned the Daniel L1 using text titled "Using Sport Fandom to Fulfill Personal and Societal Needs." And I found this paper really, really interesting. And I think that it is a very good example of what can be done with this handbook, because this paper shows us that sports fandom can fulfill individual needs. For example, the need to belong, the need for distinctiveness. It can help us to reduce uncertainty, and it can even give our life a certain meaning. And I think that we all agree that these are very important issues nowadays, especially when society is having all these problems of individuals that maybe don't know if they belong to a certain political community. For example, nowadays that we have all these different political opinions that are so divisive, that this incredibly huge polarization in our societies, this idea of belonging to something, it can really create something. It can really help us to reach out. For example, I know that this might be difficult, but in the United States, between Republicans and Democrats, well, you are a Democrat, you are a Republican, but maybe we both are, I don't know, Giants fans or Dodgers fans or whatever. I know that this is a difficult issue, but I think that it shows us that it is a very interesting aspect of the book. And the societal needs, which I found even more interesting. Sports fandom can help us to express affection. That is something really, really interesting, I must say, because you know the idea of this manly man. No, we never show emotions. We are always like, you know, very strong. But in the realm of sports, we always show emotions, and it's very interesting because we cry, because we hug each other. Even we hug people that we don't even know, and I think something very interesting is that sometimes in the internet you can see that, for example, in Twitter, in social networks, that people sometimes even relate sports with sex, for example. No, I mean, with the idea of pleasure, with the idea of love, with the idea of certain sort of devotion and even arousement. So I think that's really interesting to analyze. The other societal need observed by the author is that sports fandom helps us to enhance communication. The third one is the part of the socializing process, and the last one is integration. I think that when you talk about socializing process, that it is really, really important, because sometimes we tend to focus on education, formal education, or even what we learn at home, but sometimes we really learn to deal with the others, with society at large, in stadiums, and with our fellow our friends when we go to school are as well fans of other teams. So that is a very important socializing aspect that it has not been sufficiently observed, I would say. And integration, well, this is the utmost interest for sociologists, because, as I was saying earlier, integration nowadays is a big problem, because we don't really know where we stand nowadays. And in this regard, sports has kind of it's a two-faced phenomenon, because on the one hand it creates integration, but integration can create as well sometimes conflict. But well, I would say that this paper is really theoretically is very interesting, and it shows us what we can do when we analyze a sports fandom. I'm going to say a couple of things about a couple of other texts. The text Sports Fandom, The Complexity of Performative Role Identities by Shannon Kerwin and Lorena Huber. I think this is a very interesting paper as well, because it shows us the tensions between different identities. In the paper, both authors talk about, first of all, personal identity, that is a narrative identity, and then they talk about role identities, and then they talk about social identities. And for example, in this case, you can be, for example, you can be your social identity is that you identify with a team, you're a fan of a team, but your role identity related to that team, you can be a fan, you can be a spectator, you can be a consumer, you can be an athlete. So this paper shows us how many different approaches there are to being a fan of a team, or to be, or to have better stated, to have an identification with a certain team. And for example, it shows as well, and as other papers in the book, how our fandom changes with the time. For example, for women can be huge fans, but when they have babies, sometimes they have to, because of their social division of sexual labor in society, the traditional one at least, they have to take care of the baby. So they cannot go to stadiums anymore, so they have to record the games, and although the fandom is still very important to them, they cannot express it in the very same way as they used to. So this shows us that these identities change in time, and they change as well in relation to a certain social situation. The other paper, very interesting one, by Catherine Jones, Stacy Pope, and Kim Toffeletti, about women as sports fans. It's really interesting as well, because it shows us that women challenge traditional femininity when they support teams. Well, not all of the time, obviously, but they can challenge that, because they are always they have been viewed as lesser fans, or not real fans, because they cannot follow a team or do the things that we men do, shout, scream, and be very aggressive. They challenge all this masculinity idea, of traditional masculinity idea, and they are fans, but they are fans in a very own way. And I think that is really interesting to observe, because it shows us as well alternatives for us men to be fans. That we don't have to be sort of speaking as primitive as we are, or to behave as primitive as we behave most of the time. Other texts give us methodological recommendations, for example, how to do ethnography when we are doing this sort of research. That is very interesting as well. And they show us as well different theoretical approaches. For example, they use the framing analysis approach developed by Erving Goffman, a very famous sociologist, to analyze the way the media, how the media frames the fandom. So I really think that the book covers a great deal of issues, and it's from many different disciplinary perspectives, theoretical perspectives, methodological perspectives. It's a very, very interesting book. Well, so obviously I absolutely recommend everybody to read the book, especially those who are interested in these sort of issues, sports fandom. But I want to say a couple of things to finish this commentary. Even if this is a very good book, I have to say that no book about sports and fandom is complete without chapters about Latin America. Even if one of the chapters of the book, written by Ana Carolina Vimeiro, analyzes the ecosystem of football supporter cultures in Brazil, more research must be done. As we all know, football, soccer, as you call it in the US, is huge in Latin America, and although fandom here has some similarities with fandom in Europe, there are important differences that must be researched. So now, what I want to say to finish this, I'm going to show a couple of images and give some examples of fandom here in Latin America that I think are interesting, and as well to talk about very, very few academic work about fandom that has been, and sports that has been done here in Latin America as well. So 1 second, please. This is very, very okay. Okay. Let's do it. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm sharing now my screen. These are just a couple of books. In sociology, we have not studied the sports that thoroughly, but we have a couple of interesting books about sports, not necessarily fandom. These are just 2 examples: Norbert Elias and Eric Dunning, Quest for Excitement, Sport and Leisure in the Civilizing Process, and Loic Wakand, Body and Soul, notebooks of an apprentice boxer. I mean, this is a interesting ethnography book, because Wakan learned how to box himself in order to write this book. But well, now let's go to the examples that I was talking about earlier. Well, I mean, the hinchas, as we call the fans here in Latin America, the hinchas in Argentina are something else. Completely. They are on a very different level. It is a wonderful thing to see. Whereas in other countries, including Mexico, people who support different teams can sit next to each other at the stadium. In Argentina, this is considered as an uncivilized act. Obviously, this sounds funny, and sometimes it's funny, but sometimes this identification with the team transforms the others, the other fans, not only in fans of another team, but in inferior or even evil beings, and this becomes an invitation to violence. It is important to mention that violence not only happens in Argentina. Here in Mexico, some months ago, we had a clash between fans of two different teams that was horrible. You know, so, but well, I think that hinchas in Argentina are like a fantastic thing to object of study. The way that women are nowadays here in Mexico, and specifically in Mexico, becoming part of this ecosystem of fandom. This is a very good example, the podcast Cantera en Rosa, that this is translated as Quarry in Pink, because where this team trains is called the Quarry, because it used to be, it is kind of a quarry. And this is interesting because here in Mexico, not many people like women to talk about sports, to analyze sports or to give their share opinions. These girls in Cantera en Rosa not only speak about the football team where women play, or the league of women, soccer league of women, but they talk about as well of the male the male team. No, and it's really interesting because there are struggles here all of the time for women to be part of this. I'm gonna mention one last example about it. There is a broadcaster called Marion Reimers, and she works nowadays for, I think it is HBO, but she used to work for Fox Sports. Every time that she is broadcasting or analyzing a match in the Champions League, it becomes a trending Twitter a trending topic on Twitter, because men really hate her. I mean, but it is completely irrational. She is super articulated, super intelligent. She speaks German, but people get offended because she speaks German, or she is way too clever or something. So it is a very interesting phenomenon. The Cúcuta fans in Colombia, well, I'm going to read this from the newspaper. Colombian soccer fans brought a coffin in 2011 with the body of a 17-year-old boy inside to a match between Deportivo Cúcuta and Envigado. Christopher Jacome, a big fan of Cúcuta, was gunned down Saturday in a park while playing soccer, accordingly to Colombian reports. Friends of Jacome took his body from the funeral home after the wake and brought it into Cúcuta's General Santander Stadium for the game Sunday. I mean, this is the level of fandom here. Obviously, the authorities of the stadium were completely were sleeping because this is not supposed to happen, but it shows us the level of commitment, and this was the boys' kind of dream in a certain way. And one last example, and I think this has a lot to do with what Dorothy was telling us before, here in Mexico, as I was saying earlier, there are lots of fans from US teams, but really, really lots of fans. And American football is huge in Mexico. I mean, maybe you know, but the largest crowd ever for an NFL game was here in a preseason matchup here in Mexico City. Preseason, it was like the first preseason game. It was an awful game because it was raining. It was like 3-0 the score, or 6-3 or something like that. But more than 100,000 persons were attending to this game, and there are as well these clubs of the teams here. For example, here we see the Steeler Gang, the Mexico chapter, in the Ángel de la Independencia here in Mexico City. I mean, and almost in every major city in Mexico, there are obviously Steelers fans because they are everywhere, but Cowboys fans as well, 49ers fans, Raiders fans. I mean, those clubs are smaller, but it is very interesting because they travel to Pittsburgh, to San Francisco, and they even invite players to attend to some parties and stuff like that. So this is as well a very interesting thing of this kind of global fan, you know. And well, just to end up this presentation, I'm going to mention one among other examples. Yes, one colleague of us, Roger Magazine, who actually is from the USA, he wrote, he works here in Mexico City at the Universidad Iberoamericana, and he wrote this book, Blue and Gold as My Heart, about the hinchas, the barras for the Pumas of the UNAM, the university where we are having this presentation right now. They have this soccer team, the Pumas, and he wrote this ethnography about masculinity, youth, and power in this barra. No, so well, thank you very much for the book. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that that I was clear enough. But I really congratulate you for the work, and I really think that all of the libraries, university libraries in Mexico should have this book because it is a very interesting topic and a very good book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge, for the very thorough read, and it can give our audience a sense of what this whole book is about and what they can find in it. Thank you very much. So we can start with questions now. I don't know if anyone here in Zoom, Alejandro.
Well, I just want to start with some comments, and I want to explain why I think this book is so important for us, especially our community in UNAM, that we, as Yolanda said, we work in the North American Research Center. So our mission is to study the US and Canada in relation to Mexico, and how the societies and the different levels, governmental, migrants, and the different groups, social groups, get in contact among the US and Mexico. And I think that this dimension of sports and fandom is a particular rich area that hasn't been researched under this view. Dorothy chapter, I think, is particularly relevant for this. And as Jorge has said, we have many connections through different sports. Football, baseball are huge in Mexico. We have a national league, a baseball league, and American baseball or different teams have traditionally invite or take players from Mexico, as Valenzuela for Dodgers, that was so huge and visible for Mexico. And so this fandom has been built through different ways. The geographical border that we share, it also creates kind of a local transnational fandom, because people in Tijuana cheers for teams in San Diego, They don't understand that in Mexico City we cheer for Pittsburgh, but there's all these different connections. And I think what is important is that there's a sense of community being created, of national communities through different ways. There's also a representation of the United States in Mexico through the fans that watch US sports. There's an emotional connection to those teams, and all these virtual communities that are created, they also put in contact Mexicans living in Chicago and fans of Chicago Bears in Mexico City, and they interchange and they, create this sense of community. And also in the other way, I mean, it's not only Mexicans here cheering for being fans of American teams, but the Mexican community and the Latin American communities in the US, they are also very connected to the sports being happening in Mexico. So, through soccer teams and Mexican soccer teams doing tours in the US and participating in different matches, and all that thing creates this relationship between US and Mexico that has so many dimensions and can have many meanings that I think we should go deeper into that. And just the second point is that I think the book is very important for example, for me, that I'm just starting to read about these studies of fandom and sports. I think the book gives us a wonderful overview of the possibilities that are there, that what already we know that the research has been done, but particularly I think it's very important of the book and every chapter is that the gaps in the literature and new avenues for research are very clear, very well explained in every chapter. So I encourage everybody that is seeing us and students and people that is deciding, where to take their research in their PhD student or PhD students, that these books can give a lot of relevant clues of where to go in this area. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I absolutely agree. We already have some questions from YouTube. If someone else in the chat has some questions, you can type it on the chat and I'll get to it. Lily Mozo asks, hi, who researches these topics in Mexico? What disciplines, universities, or departments? I have an idea about this, so I'm going to take the liberty to answer this one. One of the issues that Danielle and Anne very clearly state in the introduction, and I think it's very powerful, is that it's hard for researchers to find each other because a lot of times this kind of research is hidden under other broadest disciplines. So it's hard to find each other. It's hard to pinpoint a department. But here in Mexico is Dr. Magazine, as Jorge stated, Dr. Varela, who is in UNAM. There's also very important scholarship produced in COLEF, Frontera Norte, and they come from a lot of different backgrounds. Also in Comexo, there's a new line of research, which is the latest one to be founded, about leisure, play, and entertainment. We have another question, Alexis, who says, thanks for the great presentation. Is there research about sustaining Mexican identity in transnational migrants through sports, especially soccer?
So I've actually looked for this research. So let me just sort of flag this. I've been looking in English because it's the only language I am fluent in. I did live in Merida for 3 months in undergrad, so 20 some years ago. Do not remember very much, so cannot read academic research in it for sure. But we have a soccer team, a football team in Columbus named the Columbus Crew that actually has a surprisingly large fan base coming from Latin America and Mexico in particular, and Honduras, Belize, those areas. And the Crew has been working to be better at engaging in bilingual marketing communications. And so one of my friends and colleagues went to work for the Crew doing Spanish translations and Spanish interpretation and doing their Spanish social media. So he and I did a pretty extensive search trying to find work on this area, and we really didn't find a lot of luck. So I'd be curious to hear those of you who are in that area, if you know of anything, because it certainly was not something that we were able to find from here, which is, again, one of the challenges when you're trying to do this sort of work is finding it, accessing it, being able to understand what's being said in a meaningful way, right? So you can accurately represent the work. So I would love to know if stuff's happening and if people reach out to me, if you find material, because it's something I think is really, really important. And it's been difficult for us to find here on our end.
Thank you. Karina Velasquez says, Dr. Collins' comments on the larger political implications of the encouragement of non-local fans on a global scale, NFL or NBA, as perhaps a form of US soft power?
I can speak to that. And to me, that is like a legitimate concern, right? In that, because American football, because the NBA is so popular in other parts of the world, right? It does give the US power in these markets. And this is like a tricky question for me in the sense of this is the product that individuals want, but we also don't want to give people in those countries where they're super popular also want opportunities to play, to have teams that are created locally or in their nation. On the positive side, right, we are starting to see more international players, particularly in the NBA, actually coming to America to play. So I think, when, for example, basketball becomes popular in a nation where maybe it isn't, basketball was created here in America and then it was exported around the world. It takes time for there to be a development. If you go back, even to the 80s and the 90s, and you think about Olympic basketball, right? And how like the US, the dream team was like, that was terrible. But that doesn't exist anymore, right? Like the rest of the world is catching up. So I think I don't want to minimize the concern because I think it is a huge concern, but I also think like the world is going to catch up like as sports are introduced, but it takes time to train people to play those sports at the highest levels. Like, why is soccer in America not as great? Because as little as 40 years ago, soccer was something your kids did on a Saturday morning running around the elementary school field. It takes time and generations to build the kind of history and traditions around a sport that encourage the best athletes to play that sport, right? Like your best athletes in any country, I think, naturally gravitate toward the sports that get the most visibility. And so I think it takes time for that ball to get rolling. I don't know if that adequately indicates, but this is a tricky question. And I think it's one that people working in sport on the industry side really need to be cognizant of. I have very mixed feelings about leagues and teams that like limit the number of players from overseas that can come. Like I said, from a sociological and political standpoint, like I totally get that. And I'm actually really behind that from like the person that is a former athlete and a competitive person who enjoys sport competition is like a little like, oh, but don't you want the best players you can possibly get on your court? So that is a conflict for me internally, between sort of the two sides of my life, like between the rabid fan who just wants to watch the best action and the person who is sort of globally socially minded huge conflict.
Thank you very much. Pedro Páramo asks, oh, no, there's a comment. There is also this book, Offside, Fuera de Lugar, Fútbol y Migraciones en el Mundo Contemporáneo, which means Offside, Football and Migration in the Contemporary World, from Guillermo Alonso Meneses and Luis Escala Rabadán del Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Yes, they have been producing a lot of very interesting academic research on football, particularly. Leah Jacob asks, she says, haven't had the chance to read the book, but a question for all these speakers. Could you elaborate on the theoretical and political implications of your work regarding virtual communities? Many thanks.
On virtual communities? That was
yes. Yes, theoretical and political implications of your work regarding virtual communities.
So Anne and I, one of our earlier works, we wrote a book Anne alluded to earlier on how fandom is performed. And so the idea being that fandom is always contextual, negotiable, and relational. So the ways we perform our fandom, the things we do change on depending on the circumstances, where we are, who we're with, the context. And so I think certainly from our work often is centered in that. And we've really thought quite a bit about how this works in our own lives, how this works with the ways we perform fandom, how the ways, like when we were the only, there are very few women and no American women who were at Aston Villa football club matches in, 15 years ago when we started doing this research. And so we very much were interested in both the theoretical and, the politics of that, right? So not political in like a state perspective, but the politics of gender and the politics of sport and how those intersect. And I think certainly a lot of that has informed the ways we've continued to do this work and the ways that we've thought about ourselves as scholars and we've thought about ourselves as members of this academic community. And I think I forgot part of the question, but in terms of the theoretical approach, we very much are interested both as scholars and as fans and how we perform fandom and how we perform scholarship of fandom and the ways we choose to foreground perspectives and highlight perspectives that we think are really, really important in trying to sort of live and embody those principles in what we do.
The thing that I would add to that in terms of virtual fandom is that, I said at the very beginning that Danielle and I are situated within communications schools and media schools. And I think one of the things that's really important to think about in terms of fandom, and I think that Dorothy's work on the non-local fans, this phenomenon would not exist were it not for mediated fandom. That the reason that we are able to have these very devoted fan bases for the Pittsburgh Steelers, go Steelers, I'm a Steelers fan, in Mexico City is because you are able to watch the games, as Dorothy talked about. Like you can go to a sports bar, or you can just subscribe, or you can watch on your phone. And so there are definite political implications to the broadcast contracts and the billions of dollars that are tied up in broadcast contracts, and how those contracts then filter down to the individual teams and clubs, and who's making money off of those things, and how fan bases, including virtual fan bases, are monetized. And so I think, there's a lot of ways that we can examine that and think about that. As Danielle mentioned, we tend to come at it from a performative perspective, thinking about the ways that our fandom isn't stagnant. It is not like you don't just become a fan and then you are one thing. That our fandom is fluid, and we are constantly negotiating how we exist within our fan spaces and our fan identity.
I think just to add to that, and this may go a slight bit away from here, is this notion that the idea of like community and the word community and what it means. If 2 points, I think it's evolving. Like, I think if you asked people, if we could travel back in time and ask people in 1930 what the word community means, they'd be like, oh, that's the neighborhood I live in. I live in the Brooklyn community. I'm from New York City. And that would be the answer that probably 80% of people would give you, right? And maybe if you dug a little bit deeper, you would hear, well, I'm Jewish, so I'm part of the Jewish community. You might like hear some things like that. One very interesting point that I learned during grad school was, and again, like Anne and Danielle talk about, right? We come at this from a very Western perspective, that in Korean in particular, and apparently in other Asian languages, there is no word that is the equivalent of community. There are words for neighborhood. There are words for like geographic area, but the concept of community as the West sees it now, right? Because if you ask people like, what is your community? You're going to hear everything from, I'm Jewish, so I'm the part of the Jewish community. I like live in Cleveland, so Cleveland is my community. You're going to hear, oh, my community is other Browns fans. You're going to hear, I'm part of the LGBT community, right? So, and I think honestly, most people would not really say Cleveland is their community, right? Like when you say community to someone now, I think most people actually identify it more with those social identities that are truly important to them. And I honestly think the geographic piece is becoming less important. So I think the role of these virtual communities is evolving. And I think as the definition of community and what we think something needs to have to be a community evolves, either language will have to like evolve a little bit and like come up with some new words, or we're going to see like a wider array of how this word is defined. I'll tell you, I went through at one point in graduate school pounds and pounds of literature looking for like one consensus on what a community is. And going back even as far as like the 1950s, there were like 54 definitions of what community means. So when we talk about community, like we're either going to have to start putting some like taglines on that or some better definition. And I do think that it's also very cultural. And I haven't worked really internationally, but I do know sort of anecdotally that in other parts of the world, the word community means something very different than what it does here.
Yeah.
So one thing I just wanted to add really quickly about the virtual fans or the virtual communities, as we are commonly using it at this moment. My husband is from London, and he was raised as a Tottenham Hotspur fan. And I met him while I was doing my research on Aston Villa, which is in Birmingham, England. Tottenham Hotspur's in London. And I wrote a piece that was autoethnographic, so sort of about my experience falling in love with Birmingham and Aston Villa. And one thing that this really centered on was how, as I went through my life, as my husband moved to the States, as we had kids, my fandom had to change because I didn't have time to be a virtual fan anymore. I didn't have time to spend in these on message boards. I didn't have time to do all these things that my husband was doing. Plus I was doing this professionally because I was doing our analysis and Anne and I were writing. And so much of my husband's connection to his home and his family is based on their shared fandom of Tottenham Hotspur. That is the link between my husband and his family. And his dad passed away this summer. And my husband, sort of his response has been to really dig into that fandom again and really find ways to engage with Tottenham Hotspur, because that connection to his family is the primary way he and his dad engaged. And it was sort of, they would talk after every match and every big moment. And so it's really interesting to me as we think about these virtual communities that now my husband, who has stayed a fan the whole time, but now he has the mechanism to really feel that emotional connection to his father and to his childhood that he wouldn't have if we didn't have sport and we didn't have the technology to have those shared moments.
I think that's really interesting to me in the sense that when I did my sort of initial study and my initial article on this, which came out of my master's thesis, I also asked some qualitative questions. I did a quantitative study, but I asked some qualitative questions on this survey just kind of to see what people would write. And I never really did anything with the data other than read them and think, the number of people that say, well, I live 2,000 miles away and I'm a bigger fan now because this is the thing that connects me to my brothers. Like, we don't have anything in common anymore because we're spread out to four corners of the earth. And the only thing we have to talk about is what happened during the Steelers game. Like, or people who said, I really miss my home. I live in wherever, but I'm truly a New Yorker. And so this, watching the Yankees games or what have you, watching the Giants games reminds me that I'm still in New York. So it's very interesting to hear a personal story that really supports those comments. And they were very interesting. Maybe more interesting than the quantitative part, but what we found was with these displaced fans, the key to keeping them fans was to making sure that they stayed highly identified with either their hometown or something in that hometown, like a family member, or like as soon as people started to like people who said, oh, well, I'm not really I'm from New York, but I haven't lived there for a long time. So now I really consider myself to be a Clevelander. Those people had lower levels of identification. So it was interesting, like they had to have something to hang on to in that home community.
Thank you very much. That's super interesting. And I have all of these ideas, but I'll keep reading the questions. Ricardo has a question. If someone here wants to, just say their question out loud, they can do it. Ricardo, do you?
Sure. It was very interesting when you were talking about the displaced fans that move and relocate, or all these identities that are formed for people that are not necessarily at the same place as their team. But I would love to hear your thoughts about this other side of the relocation, where teams have very specific communities at certain locations, and then they leave them behind. Like, I'm thinking like when the Raiders left LA and their fans stayed loyal, and it was like this working class community, very attached to the team, and then they've relocated another time after that. But on the other side, there's like the San Diego Chargers that had this very loyal fan base, and then they moved to LA and they didn't keep those fans, and they weren't able to build new fans. So now they're in a weird limbo. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this other side of team and fans displacement.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Ricardo. And Danielle has very personal experience with this as a Cleveland Browns fan. So the Browns, we often joke that within our division that basically you have the Browns, the old Browns, and the other Browns, because both the Bengals, the Raiders, and the Browns all in one way, shape, or form are sort of the Browns. And then there are the Steelers. And so it's an interesting phenomenon. And Danielle and I wrote a piece a number of years ago that sort of looked at fandom through the lens of the ship of Theseus. If you are familiar with this, this sort of philosophical thought experiment that a ship is traveling, and as it is traveling, parts of it need to be replaced. And so the ship that leaves port is a completely different ship by the time it enters a new port. And so can we say that it's still the same ship? And in sports, we see the same phenomenon, right? Like the players change, the coaches change, and now even the cities change, teams pick up and move. And so when you say that you are a Cleveland Browns fan, what does that really mean? And the conclusion that we came to is that really what you are a fan of is fandom. You are a fan of the community. You are a fan of the traditions. You are a fan of the stories that you share. And that is the connection that we feel. And it's why we can maintain a loyalty even when our team can change in every other way conceivable, including moving cities. So that was sort of how we define that problem.
And I also think, so as a Browns fan, my whole life, I grew up in Northeast Ohio and I was raised a Browns fan. And we are at a sort of crisis point because our team has been terrible my life. And we signed a quarterback who had 20 plus sexual assault allegations against him. And I took Cleveland Browns fan off my bios. Many of my friends turned in season tickets. Like, we're really actively rejecting the Browns in a way that to me feels stronger than when the Browns left. Because when they left to go to Baltimore, that was blamed on the owner. So it wasn't about the team, it was about the owner. Even though the team and the owners made the decision to hire this player, it feels very different in that it feels like, you know, an ethical question about whether or not to follow this fandom. So it's interesting to me as a scholar to look at sort of this idea that our teams have betrayed us, right? The idea that our teams have betrayed the fandom by making the choices that they've made. And that sense of betrayal, I think, has quite a bit to do with how people react to the moves. If it's a move that makes sense to the fan base, you know, they kind of understand why it happened. I think they're maybe a little bit more patient or tolerant, but if it's seen as something that's purely commercial, like for example, when Manchester United was purchased by the Glazers, fans were outraged, right? Because this was something that was seen as strictly a money move and bad for the team, bad for the fans, and actually a decision made without thinking about the fans at all. And that sense of betrayal made it much harder for fans to negotiate their relationship with the team. So it's a really interesting case to look at sort of how fans react to these moves. But then also just even when the team isn't moving, but there is something happens that sort of feels very aggressively contrary to the interests of the fans or the reputation of the fandom.
Thank you. That's super interesting. I appreciate your response.
I was just going to kind of chime in and say, I think that this is also an area where there's like evolution. Like if you go back and you read Craig Hyatt's work about the Hartford Whalers, which was now written, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, close to 15 years ago, right? People were bitter, like super bitter, right? Hartford Whalers fans, some of them said, I don't even watch hockey anymore because I'm so angry that my team is gone, right? And it was harder in those days to stay engaged. Like almost no one became a Hurricanes fan. Like some people are like, well, there's lots of other hockey to watch. So, you know, I'm just going to be a college hockey fan now. I'm just like going to be pissy at the NHL, frankly. And I'm not going to watch the NHL, but I'll watch all these other things because I love hockey. But I think that's starting to evolve a little because it is easier to like stay like where you can follow the team. But I do think, you know, I think there's some interesting stories that connect to this. The case of the Charlotte Hornets, who were the Hornets who became the Pelicans, the Hornets who moved and stayed the Hornets and then became the Pelicans. And then the new team, there was a new team already that was the Bobcats. The Bobcats then rebranded to become the Hornets. And boy, they worked really hard to remind people that they had been Hornets fans before. And it had a huge impact on their attendance, changing the Bobcats back to the Hornets. That is sort of a very unique situation of team realignment and rebranding. I do think that some of how people react to it really depends on how much they are still able to access. But I think people see it as a different team when it moves for the most part. And I think that's why they lose a lot of their fans. Like, it's not just that people are angry, it's that they see it as a different team. It's not relevant to them anymore. But I think we're going to see some evolution of that as it becomes still, you know, if you were only watching your football games via, you know, some form of media, not going in person, is it really relevant that they've moved? Does it matter as much to you? As in the days when sort of the Brooklyn Dodgers left and they were out and that was it. So I think we're going to see some evolution in that as technology continues to change.
Thank you. Just one little thing. Si alguien necesita una constancia de participación, está el formulario en el chat. We have another questions, and I think it's just enough time so we can wrap it up right before 12. The audience is being very participant. Okay, so here we have, my question is for any of the speakers. Thank you for all the contributions. And I want to ask, do you consider that there is a cult of personality in sports fans? Or maybe, is it just a temporary passion for a team that represents a particular idea or concept?
So in terms, I might not be interpreting the question correctly, but one of the things I find really interesting is when fans really, really love a particular player. And so they will follow that player from team to team, right? And so an example I could think of, again, Tottenham Hotspur, there is a Korean player named Son, right? And Korean fans fly to London regularly to watch him play in the Premier League. He's a very, very popular player. He's an icon in Korea. But when and so they're huge Spurs fans, right? But when he leaves Spurs, no one expects those fans to stay Tottenham Hotspur fans, right? They're there for him, and he is the draw more than other people. I do think that we have fans like that. Like, I think there are fans of Tom Brady who, when he went from the Patriots to Florida, Tampa Bay, they wanted to follow him. And so there was sort of this openness to, we are going to continue following him and his team. But fandom, outside of that, oftentimes fandom for a team really is something that is fundamental to your identity. And so therefore, you sort of stick with that team. The players will, as Anne mentioned, that piece we wrote about Chip Athesius, the players will change, the coaches will change, the uniforms will change, the owners will change, but we're what stays. So we're really the heart of that team and that fandom. So when you make a conscious decision to reject that fandom, it could really be an identity crisis for people. So while we have different reasons and different motives for following teams and supporting teams, and again, as we go through life, our life stages add to that fluidity in terms of how much we can know or care about the team, there's always still that core identification with the team that tends to stay with you over time. Certainly, you have a team that does really, really well. And so all of a sudden you have a lot of followers. Like, if you look at the most valuable teams in the world, the most valuable sports franchises, they tend to have had great success in the past, and they tend to be in fairly major markets. So like New York teams would have a lot of followers, London teams would have a lot of followers, because it's a little bit easier to access those. But typically, particularly for teams that are in smaller markets, that fandom it feels very personal. It's very much tied to who you are. So it's less of a temporary passion.
Thank you very much. Dot, you wanted to add something?
Well, I was just going to say, I think really how you, and I might be a little off on what the question was looking for, is just that there are all these points of identification that draw people to be fans, right? Like, the most obvious one is, this team represents my city or my community. But I think there's an increasing number of them, for example, sort of the Jeremy Lin factor, right? In the NBA, like, I connect to this guy because I share a common heritage, or LGBT people, women who are really invested in the WNBA, right? There's all these other sort of points of connection. And I think how much you are impacted by like various changes to the team really depends on what your attachment points are, right? So like, for somebody who is like this idea of following a player and leaving with a player, right? Well, if you don't care about the city, you're there just for that player, or you were a Patriots fan with Tom Brady, but you're not from New England, right? It's a lot easier to sort of leave and follow him. I just think that, I think there's so many different strands of identity that people use to connect to these teams. And, one point of my research has always kind of been, if you're a team, like from the business standpoint, come up with as many strands to hold people there, like it's like a spider web, right? And the more connections you have, if you slash out one little connection in a spider web, most of the web stays functional. Right. And so you don't want to just have them connected one way. You want to try to find like all these little spiders who can go out and connect people.
And I'm just going to add one more thing I thought of when Dot was talking. I think one more piece of this is in that triangle that Dot showed. the connections between individuals. So if you've connected and built relationships with other members of that fan community, I think you're much more likely to stay than if your fandom is primarily based on just identification to that team because of some characteristic about it. That underlying sense of community and connection among fans is often what reinforces and like provides those like psychological and emotional benefits to remaining true to that fandom.
Right. It's this that concept of brand community, people who are tied, right, by a common interest or activity or product, right? And in this case, a sports team is kind of a product, right, or an interest. And so if you take it away from sport, right, if you have these connections, if all your friends are doing X, you're much less likely to leave, right? If you hang out with, 10 guys you've been watching the Patriots with for 10 years, and then Tom Brady leaves, well, now I'm going to go watch Jacksonville games, right? So people are like, well, wait, but I still want to hang out with these guys because this is my relationship is not just to the Patriots, it's also to all these people that I've been watching football with for all these years.
So just one thing, and I'm sorry I had to hop off for just a second. So, but something that I was also thinking about is that, we talked about the fact that fandom is fluid, that we are not stagnant in our fandom. None of our identities are stagnant or static. And so I think, Danielle's comment about sort of renegotiating her relationship to the Cleveland Browns is not just about something changing within the Browns, but for a lot of people, as your own other identities evolve and the way that you see yourself changes, that may change your relationship to your fan team, the athlete, or whatever it is. And so I think all of this is just really fluid. And these are complex relationships. I like Dorothy's analogy of the web. It's a complex web that we have. And so all of it may change. So it may not be that anything within a team changes. It could be something about your own identity that changes then the way you think about that fandom and that relationship that you have to a team.
Thank you very much. We have a last question. Ruth, do you want to say it out loud?
Yeah, sure. Hi, good morning. My English is not great, but I will try my best. Well, Jorge Galindo mentioned that through sports, we can be able to express our emotions because our patriarchal society, men are tend to not express their emotions at all. Do you believe that being a fan and have, this space where men can share their emotions will increase or decrease the pressure of not being able to cry or hug other men without being criticized due to our patriarchal society?
It's a great question. I think it is, one of the things that Danielle and I wrote about in looking at female fans of the NFL is in the same way that sports provides a space where men can show emotions that are not traditionally masculine associated emotions, crying, hugging, all of that. It's also a space where women can be aggressive and can express anger and frustration, which traditionally women are not encouraged to emote in those ways. So yeah, I do think that again, this is part of why sports and sports fandom is really important, because it is, I said it at the opening of my comments, that it's one of those areas where the gender binary is so clearly reinforced, and it is particularly in the play of sports and engagement as athletes. It's very much divided into male and female. But in terms of fan expressions, it is also a place where you get to play with and challenge those gendered expectations. And I think that does then bleed over into other areas of life. I would like to think that generally we are seeing a period where a lot of our gendered norms are being challenged. And I think that we've seen some really great examples in recent years of athletes being very open about their mental health struggles and being very open about the pressures that they feel, and seeing male athletes cry when they lose. And these are our heroes. These are aspirational people that we look up to and often try to emulate. So I think it cuts across not just fans getting to experience these things, and then maybe they will be more likely to experience those things or enact those performances outside of their fandom. But I think it's also in what we see athletes doing and what that gives permission then for other people to do.
And I would add, like, much like we see in life, there are healthy expressions of emotions and then toxic and dangerous expressions of emotion. And one thing that researchers have found in the past is that there is a correlation between teams losing major games and increases in domestic violence calls to the police. And so, there's certainly concern that particularly when you combine alcohol and strong emotions, that can lead to really unhealthy, toxic, dangerous behaviors. Likewise, you sometimes feel like you'll see where a team wins a championship and that town goes crazy and there's all kinds of violence in the streets, like people are flipping over cars and, trashing stuff. It kind of turns into more of a riot. So I think that one thing we're looking at in sports fan research is to try and better understand how we can better understand the ways that healthy emotions are expressed through sport fandom. So in terms of being able to express grief and joy and all these things that often fans, particularly male fans, don't have cultural permission to express, but also navigate those in a way that doesn't lead to aggression and sort of dangerous scenarios. But certainly, my highest highs in my life have been related to sports, like when teams win and the joy you feel, that's something that, I don't have other things that sort of replicate that. Right. And so I think that is one of my favorite parts of being a sports fan is it's kind of, I pick terrible teams to support and that I don't get the joys very often, but boy, when I get them, does it feel great, so it's this really, it is a great way to understand how we can have these sort of emotional impacts in a thing that is really not something I'm performing as an athlete, but I'm performing as a fan.
Thank you very much. It's time to wrap this up. I want to close this session by encouraging the students and the researchers that are joining us to run with this spark, take this theme seriously, build upon this great research. You can buy the book at the Routledge site, and you can also check it out through Cezanne's library. And this seminar is a part of 3 different seminars that we are having around leisure studies. Our next session will be around soccer in Mexico City, and also Mexican fans of soccer in the States. So we hope we can count with you and you can come join us again. Thank you very much to everyone that came and for being so engaged in the session. Thank you very much.
And
yes,
thank you for
so
inviting us.
Yeah, thank you. And Danielle, I saw put her contact information in the chat. You can find me online. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has follow-ups. So,
or if anyone's